Good news! Joe Biden is bundling together a series of really complex global conflicts in order to get loads and loads of money for potential escalating wars with China, Russia, and across the Middle East. Bundling all these things together to get new aid in a rambling, incoherent speech is surely a great thing for all of us that are looking forward to Armageddon. Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me on our mutual voyage to awakening that we undertake together in increasingly complex conditions where it becomes difficult to ignore that there is a requirement for a seismic epochal shift within us and beyond us. I'm of course referring to the numerous conflicts across the world that don't seem to have resolution anywhere in mind. Ukraine and Russia is prolonged. Israel and their Middle Eastern conflicts are so complicated and agonizing even to reflect upon, and potential wars could be beginning as a result of the relationship between China, Taiwan, and American financial interests. Joe Biden, just yesterday, in an extraordinary and rare speech, has requested more aid that puts these complex, distinct, nuanced, difficult conflicts into one bundle. When is it ever a good idea to bundle different things together? When was the last time we heard bundling in the news? Wasn't it when they were bundling together subprime mortgages? Aren't these very difficult, very distinct matters that require discrete reflection and contemplation? I don't know. Let's work that out together. Remember, download the Rumble app. You can see us there every day. Turn on the notification bell so you're informed every time that we make content, not like on other platforms where they don't inform you at all. We stream at these times and we want you to join us there. Let's get into Joe Biden's peculiar speech and think together, how should we be approaching this rather unique moment in human history together?
President Biden's national address tonight was designed to convince Congress the U.S. and the world will be safer if we help fund not just Israel, but Ukraine too.
Did you notice that prior to the escalation of the crises in the Middle East, there was a general sense that support for continual financial aid for the Ukraine-Russia conflict was starting to wane? Not because people don't love Ukrainian folk or want to support them in their humanitarian disaster, but because of the failure of the counteroffensive, a different type of understanding around the conditions that led to this war, in part because NATO themselves said, Putin told us that he would escalate this war if we did these things, and we did those things anyway. So bundling together the very, very complex situation in the Middle East where people are still reeling and grieving, and it's very difficult to see a clear pathway through it, bundling that together with Ukraine and Russia seems to me to be politically exploitative. Let me know in the chat if you agree that those issues should be regarded separately when it comes to financial and military aid.
The president defending his expected Friday request to Congress, an unprecedented estimated $105 billion in security funding for Israel and Ukraine. $60 billion is said to be slated for the fight against Russia.
So more than half of that aid for an ongoing conflict, which we've been told for a long time isn't a proxy war, that has been steadily escalating. Are you beginning to become concerned that we could be months or at most years away from a situation where there is a war, a hot war, as Tucker Carlson predicted, between the US and Russia, a conflict which is scaling up in Southeast Asia between China and America, you know, the military bases that are already there, and the semiconductor matter in Taiwan, and involvement in a conflict including multiple nations potentially in the Middle East? What would that be like? You're already seeing news reports where people are saying, yeah, America can have that level of conflict. Joe Biden saying, in my view, somewhat glibly, we're the United States, for Christ's goddamn sake. We could have as many global wars as we want. We could have another war on other planets. We don't even get me a telescope. What about one over there? Isn't this difficult enough without you reaching for a telescope to find some far-flung planet that we can start profiting from? I mean, having a war with? I mean, what is it we're doing?
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We're facing an inflection point in history.
Yeah, it is an inflection point, and here's the inflection.
One of those moments where the decisions we make today are going to determine the future for decades to come. I know these conflicts can seem far away.
No, actually, they're starting to seem increasingly local, because there's one escalating in China, there's one in Europe, and there's one in what we call the Middle East. So wherever you are, you're quite near to it. That's the thing about World War III. There's no escaping it.
And it's natural to ask, why does this matter to America?
You don't have to explain to me why it matters that we might all die in an escalating crisis. Now, I'm well aware, and I will say again, if you're a person that's emotionally and personally affected, religiously, ideologically, or because of national ties to the conflict in the Middle East or any of these conflicts, I would not seek to lecture you about something you know a lot more about than I do and you feel a lot more strongly about than I do. We're offering you a critique of the way the legacy media is amplifying the agenda of the powerful, which might not be about humanitarian issues and could be about economic issues based on all wars previously ever.
So let me share with you why making sure Israel and Ukraine succeed is vital for America's national security. You know, history has taught us.
There's sorts of few lessons history. Here's one. When you look back at wars that America got involved in because of what they said were humanitarian reasons, it looks like that wasn't it at all. Sometimes they say, for example, there are weapons of mass destruction, and there aren't weapons of mass destruction. Sometimes they attack Iraq straight after 9/11, even though most of the people involved appeared to be from Saudi Arabia. So history teaches a lot of lessons, and I would say perhaps the strongest lesson is do not trust authority. Don't seek to judge the feelings of people that are involved in a conflict in ways that blessedly I can't personally imagine. Remain open-hearted and loving to the possibility of peace. See how you can be of service and value, and stop starting wars all the time just because it's convenient for Raytheon and Lockheed Martin.
You know, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction.
I didn't like that swallow.
They keep going, and the cost and the threats to America and the world keep rising. For 75 years, NATO has kept peace in Europe.
I don't know about that really, and the efficacy of NATO or the function of NATO. I mean, they're not keeping peace particularly well at the moment. They've provoked Putin till he's in a blind fury. Essentially, it seems that there's a unipolar agenda. It seems to me there might even be an agenda to bring about this kind of cataclysm in order to legitimize further authoritarianism, surveillance, censorship, and establish the kind of control where, I don't know, and I'm just riffing here, establishment elites are able to enjoy a particular kind of life and ordinary people are controlled in ways that are unprecedented and until recently were unimaginable. But it's not like I can think of a period in recent history where most people were locked in their homes and powerful people carried on having parties and yes, I can.
And has been the cornerstone of American security. And if Putin attacks a NATO ally, we will defend every inch of NATO which the treaty requires and calls for.
Well, it's going to be difficult because people are joining up to NATO like it's going out of fashion. It's like the new TikTok, although TikTok's banned for misinformation.
We'll have something that we do not seek. Make it clear, we do not seek. We do not seek to have American troops fighting in Russia.
Uh-oh, we're getting a little bit closer. We do not seek it. I'm not seeking it like hide and go seek, like an Easter egg hunt where we're seeking it, like your dog's lost in the woods and you're seeking it. But oh no, look what's happened anyway. American troops are in Russia. That, I would say, is priming.
Are fighting against Russia. Beyond Europe, we know that our allies and maybe most importantly our adversaries and competitors are watching.
It's like weird to jump from allies to adversaries and competitors. Competing for what? That's very telling, because competitors, that's the language of economics, commerce, and business. And actually, that's probably the most truthful yet inadvertent thing that's been said in that speech. We're competing with them for resources, we're competing with them for power, we're competing with them for control over the semiconductor market. I still don't really know what a semiconductor is, but I do believe that economic interests and interests of dominion usually prevail over humanitarianism. Just looking back at previous conflicts, let me know in the chat if you agree.
They're watching our response in Ukraine as well. And if we walk away and let Putin erase Ukraine's independence, would-be aggressors around the world be emboldened to try the same.
It's not school, is it? The world's not school. Well, those gangs of bullies around the world, you got to stand up to bullies like I did. Remember Corn Pop? Remember that story? No, don't do the Corn Pop. Don't do the Corn Pop. There are not other countries that are like Russia that can pose that same kind of threat. Hey, if Russia's gotten away with it, why don't we try this in San Marino?
The risk of conflict and chaos could spread in other parts of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, especially in the Middle East.
This has been described as if organically there's this sort of cluster of global events that are taking place that aren't somehow affected to the efforts and actions of American imperialism. I'm not seeking to blame the United States of America, but when you learn that 57% of the world's autocracies have been sold weaponry by the United States and military-industrial complex corporations within the United States, with the United States, sometimes delivering those weapons, being brokers for those kind of weapons deals. Just take the example of Saudi Arabia. It's just one one obvious example. I've got no strong views on Saudi Arabia. What do I know? But I do remember Joe Biden had strong views.
Make them, in fact, the pariah that they are.
Saudi Arabia, hey, we just do a deal selling them more weapons than Donald Trump did. So what's actually going on? What's the agenda? Is this what's getting said in this conversation here true or not?
The United States and our partners across the region are working to build a better future for the Middle East. One where the Middle East is more stable, better connected to its neighbors, and through innovative projects like the India-Middle East-Europe rail corridor.
Firstly, some of the things in that sentence weren't words.
More predictable markets, more employment.
Business, corporate interests. It's really interesting, isn't it? Now, of course, we all have commercial imperatives. I'm not free from economic requirements myself, and I know that you aren't either. But ultimately, how will you be affected by these decisions that are being made? Just look at recent crises that are not military. The energy crisis. Do you know that this presented opportunity for record profits for some energy companies? What about that health crisis that we recently all went through relatively together? Do you know that Big Pharma made record profits during that period? So is it possible that what we regard as crisis, and indeed a told crisis, and for the people directly involved, are unquestionably crises of almost unimaginable scale, to the kind of corporate interests that are in positions of leadership and power that transcend the ordinary institutions of democracy as we understand them, because we've been coached and trained to believe in, oh, I'm going to vote for that guy, I like the thing you said about that, that's more like my beliefs, actually benefit from situations that the rest of us would look at and say, how the hell do we resolve this as quickly as possible? Or, oh God, we can't even say stuff like that yet because it's too painful for the people involved, and you risk sounding like you're partisan or not understanding the depth of their pain and suffering. What you shouldn't, I don't think, be doing is making it worse, or even if making it worse is too much of a contentious thing to say, given the scale, scope and nuance of these conflicts, profiting from it.
It benefits the people who would benefit the people of the Middle East and would benefit us.
Like, I trust a president a lot more that said, firstly and foremostly, all of those people that profited by investing in weapons companies that are members of Congress, with actually said you can't be in Congress anymore because your priorities are clearly off. I mean, you're supposed to be here helping us reach a consensus based on what we imagine is the will of the people of America. And I can't imagine the will of the American people is, who wants to profit from this? Guys, you should invest right now. Is that a good representation of your feelings, of your values, of your morals? This isn't being addressed right now. That's just business as usual. And business as usual is what I'm worried is what's happening.
American leadership is what holds the world together.
I don't know about that. When you look at the weapons sales, when you look at the Cold War, when you look at the proxy wars between now and the Cold War, when you look at the lack of intervention in the 2008 crisis, when the banks that collapsed the global economy and caused so much suffering in America were bailed out by Barack Obama, is American leadership what causes and creates and generates peace around the world, or is it somehow absolutely dependent on conflict and crisis because of the nature of the industries that run it?
American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all that at risk, if we walk away from Ukraine, if we turn our backs on Israel, it's just not worth it.
I think what's happened here, and let me know if this sounds too cynical for you to even imagine, people have said the war in Ukraine is becoming very unpopular because it's not going the way we said it would. But there is a lot of support for Israel because of the horrific nature of those terrorist attacks. And in the moment when people feel as heated up and as horrified by that, they're not able even to look at the complexity. So shall we start combining Ukraine and Israel in order to facilitate ongoing aid because we love people so much and we've just got to help people with weapons? Or do you think there might be another agenda? Just can you see that there might be? Can there be? Just to remember those people in Congress, just remember the arms that are being sold all around the world, 57% of them to autocracies. If you hold those things together in your mind and you listen to those words, where did it take you?
That's why tomorrow I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs, to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine, is a smart investment that's going to pay dividends for American security for generations. Help us keep American troops out of harm's way.
Oh, that's so mad. This is mad. To help us keep American troops out of harm's way. Obviously what this speech is designed to do is just make you go, oh, all right, just do that. Or be so confused that you can't make sense, because these conflicts are distinct and separate. They are separate ideas. The causes and roots of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the 2014, the complexity of what's happening in the Middle East and the economic interest that might benefit from that. And again, as I always say, that is not offering an opinion on the emotions of people involved in this conflict. I would consider that rude and unacceptable. Is there an attempt here to bundle these conflicts together in order to generate financial opportunity and opportunity of unipolar hegemonic dominion by the United States?
Help us build a world that is safer, more peaceful, more prosperous for our children and grandchildren.
When you consider your children and grandchildren, that's when a stark new perspective becomes available, isn't it? Like, hold on a minute, these wars all the time. One route is we have to slay all of our enemies irreversibly somehow, and the other one is some kind of alternative has to be considered. I mean, that's when you look beyond yourself and your own emotions and your own feelings and your own allegiances and your own alliances, anybody could perhaps have a different perspective. But certainly it exposes that the current purview is undergirded by economic interests. I mean, isn't that obvious?
On Ukraine, I'm asking Congress to make sure we can continue to send Ukraine the weapons they need to defend themselves and their country without interruption, so Ukraine can stop Putin's brutality in Ukraine. They are succeeding.
Even that sentiment that seems acceptable enough has to be paired with discourse elsewhere, where it's like, this is a bang for your buck. Ukrainians seem a bit casualty resistant. This is a very economic war. You've heard all of that other stuff. You have to pretend that a load of reality doesn't exist in order to make this reality palatable.
Let me be clear about something. We send Ukrainian equipment sitting in our stockpiles. And when we use the money allocated by Congress, we use it to replenish our own stores, our own stockpiles with new equipment. Equipment that defends America and is made in America. Patriot missiles for air defense batteries, made in Arizona.
Don't brush your lip like that. It makes it look like you're lying.
Made in Arizona.
And what was the rationale when you were making the previous weapons that went into that stockpile?
Artillery shells manufactured in 12 states across the country, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas.
Do you see how you try to make it sound like this is a sort of a job scheme for people in Arizona? You're going to have good jobs, making missiles out there in Arizona. It's going to be beautiful. If the intention was to improve the lives of people in Arizona, there are other ways of doing that. Like, unbelievable to just try to make this positive for domestic America.
You know, just as in World War II, today patriotic American workers are building the arsenal of democracy and serving the cause of freedom.
Wow, this is propaganda live. Simplification, reductivism, combining distinct and discrete issues, sometimes very complex issues, together. This is, in a sense, a very good exercise in understanding how power operates. Beyond that, though, it's pretty terrifying.
In moments like these, we have to remember who we are.
You can talk.
We're the United States of America. The United States of America.
Oh my God. Think of the way that Trump is condemned for jingoism and sort of a kind of ease with what you might call blue-collar Americans. They're only complaining because he's better at it. What's that an attempt to do? We're the United States of America. 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 That's not politics.
And there is nothing beyond our capacity if we do it together. My fellow Americans, thank you for your time. May God bless you all.
Well, I think we're going to need him because you're making some pretty terrible decisions. But let's get into some alternative facts around this issue. US President Joe Biden's speech Thursday night on national television was a demand for vast new military spending to expand the ongoing US-NATO proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. Biden's speech was not a serious attempt to convince anyone or rationally explain US foreign policy. It consisted of a series of non-sequiturs strung one after the other, with no coherent argument binding them together. Biden drew a parallel between Hamas and Russian President Vladimir Putin that objectively did not make the slightest sense. But as he spoke, it became clear that the main aim of the speech was to utilize the war in Gaza to procure a massive spending bill for the Ukraine war to prop up the Zelensky government following the failure of its summer offensive. So however you feel about the conflict, and I mean that there are a variety of opinions obviously available. That's, I suppose, what a war is. Opposing views expressed through violence. What that tells you is they don't really care other than utilizing it, using it to perpetuate the war between Russia and Ukraine. And prolonging the war. And I've heard some analysis that even has a vision of a post-war Ukraine as a kind of proxy state that BlackRock are already agreeing to invest in, where they're going to pilot new digital technology. This is not stuff I'm making up. We did a video about it. It's information that's available. Feels to me like there is another agenda entirely that's piggybacking on all this talk of aid and America's unique role in the world. Indeed, the New York Times has reported that $60 billion of the $100 billion spending bill Biden proposed in the speech will go to fight the war in Ukraine against Russia. This figure is more than twice Biden's initial request of $24 billion in August. Despite its rambling and incoherent nature, the main import of the speech is clear. America is hurtling towards global war, and the President of the United States, the so-called Commander-in-Chief, is demanding $100 billion in additional funds on top of the $1 trillion already proposed for all military spending to finance this explosion of military aggression. That does appear to be the agenda wrapped up in a confectionery of patriotic and moralistic language that I am ill at ease accepting when these figures are available. Unmentioned in the speech, but widely reported in advance of Friday's formal request to Congress, is the fact that Biden will also seek billions more in US military aid to Taiwan, an effort to provoke further conflict with China and militarize the US-Mexico border and intensify US intervention throughout Latin America. I use the phrase omni-crisis these days to, in a sense, present to you the idea that crisis is all places, all of the time. That is what's sort of being generated now, geographically and temporally. No end to crisis, just a suspended state of crisis, a suspended state of fear. And the vision of like, what's the end point of this? What would a solution look like? Why do you never see the legacy media say, but what about that Iraq war? Like, remember the incentives for that? How are we deploying different ideas and a different mentality? Or is it, hold on a minute, this is the same, isn't it? These wars, hold on. Now, again, I have to keep saying, like, I'm not talking about Israel's right to be outraged by terrorist attacks. It's not something I feel like I'm qualified to do as a human being. But this, I feel pretty qualified to comment on. Do you? Aware of the deepening opposition to the US war in Ukraine, now ending its 18-month and apparently mired in an endless, costly and bloody stalemate, Biden sought to bootstrap the conflicts in Israel to justify further spending in Ukraine, which will get the lion's share of whatever military aid bill ultimately emerges from Congress. Just on that basis alone, all of this talk ultimately leads to disproportionate expenditure on an increasingly unpopular conflict that is unpopular not for moral or ethical reasons, but because of the observable failure of a plan that we were offered just a few months ago. While Biden declared that the world was at an inflection point, this is not because war is something new for the United States. On the contrary, America has been at war for more than 30 years, and the countries which it's invaded, occupied or bombed amount to a significant portion of the world's population. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, most of North Africa, Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, Sudan. What is new is the transformation of these wars into a more general conflict, or as Leon Trotsky described it on the eve of World War II, when separate clashes and bloody local disturbances must inevitably coalesce into a conflagration of world dimensions. Now, don't be upset because Leon Trotsky has been mentioned. The analysis is the analysis. The contours of this new world war can be inferred from Biden's $100 billion bill. It is aimed at expanding the war against Russia, using the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians to trigger a new war against Iran, and preparing for an imminent war against China. The US administration is shaping the battlefield of what amounts to one continuous front in a global conflict whose goal is US dominance of the Eurasian landmass from Eastern Europe through the Middle East, Central Asia, and ultimately China. This is combined with efforts to safeguard its Western Hemisphere backyard by militarizing the US-Mexico border and disposing of political inconveniences and potential obstacles like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. If this appears like a megalomaniac program for global conquest, it is not that it is not relevant to the megalomaniacs in Wall Street and the Pentagon for whom Biden speaks when he delivers his paeans to the ability of America to do anything as long as it mobilizes its full resources. Biden even used the language of Wall Street in making his argument for the next enormous payout to the Pentagon and the US arms industry. It's a smart investment that's going to pay dividends for American security for generations. It's like dog whistle economics. American workers will pay with their living standards and social benefits and the lives of their sons and daughters, but war will certainly pay for Raytheon, Boeing and Lockheed Martin, and for the big banks and hedge funds that control them. I suppose we have to consider that the economic implications and the economic language are telling, as this might in part be an economically motivated set of decisions. Certainly the bundling together of a variety of conflicts on a variety of fronts that seem to each require their own complex analysis and a broad consensus from any population that might be funding them, either financially or at the cost of their own lives, ought be afforded. Ultimately, what's required, I suppose, is a state of awareness, a state of discernment, an ability to recognize that this language is the language of imperialism, the language of exploitation, rather than the language of patriotism and the language of a good deal for American people and supporting our partners overseas. It seems that embedded in this aid, which is being sold to us as helping partners across the world worthy of support because they're our fellow human beings, are opportunities to provoke other wars, sustain other wars. And it's difficult, isn't it, knowing as we do that people in Congress went out and invested in stocks and shares during those days, knowing the amount of money that's spent on lobbying and donations, knowing that whoever you have in the White House, you're going to have a pro-war president, with a few notable exceptions that don't, let's face it, do well at the hands of the establishment. It's pretty clear that the driving factor behind this is not a moral and ethical one. It's an economic one. It's a hegemonic, almost demonic one of exploitation and opportunity. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the chat? Remember, we stream every day. Download the app, turn on notifications so you see our content. The streams are where it's at. Join us in the stream. And if you can become an awakened wonder, join our community even deeper to get access to more of our content, do that as well. But more important than any of that is that if you can, please stay free.